Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information presented in this deep dive is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes and does not constitute professional, legal, financial, or psychological advice. While we will be extensively analyzing family law data, demographic shifts, and socioeconomic metrics, these figures represent historical trends and potential outcomes at a macro level. They are not predictive models for your personal life or relationship. Navigating marriage, separation, and the dissolution of a domestic partnership involves highly complex legal and emotional realities that vary drastically by jurisdiction and individual circumstance. If you are facing family law issues, it is imperative that you conduct your own due diligence and consult with a licensed attorney or a qualified professional in your specific state. We are here to analyze the societal data, not to provide individual counsel. Picture the vast, sun-drenched expanses of the American Southwest. It is a region defined by boundless horizons, rapid economic expansion, and the enduring mythos of the frontier. Millions of Americans have packed up their lives and relocated to states like Texas, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah, chasing the promise of lower taxes, year-round sunshine, and a booming housing market. But beneath the surface of these sprawling subdivisions and glittering desert metropolises lies a silent, deeply complex demographic earthquake. While the national discourse often focuses on job growth and real estate in the Sun Belt, there is a shadow narrative playing out inside the family courts of this region. We are witnessing a fundamental fracturing of the American household, accelerated by the unique pressures of the southwestern landscape. Consider this carefully. While the overall national divorce rate has shown signs of a gradual decline over the last 2 decades, driven largely by millennials marrying later in life, the statistical landscape of the Southwest presents a series of shocking anomalies and severe localized spikes. We are looking at a region where the collision of transient populations, rapid economic booms, and isolated suburban sprawl has created a pressure cooker for domestic stability. Nevada, for instance, has long held a historical reputation as the dissolution capital of the country, a legacy born from mid-century laws designed to attract tourists seeking quick legal separations. But the modern crisis is no longer about transient visitors stopping in Las Vegas to end a marriage. It is about the families who actually live there, and the families migrating to neighboring states, who are finding that the geographic cure does not solve relational fragility. In the next few minutes, we are going to open a loop on a phenomenon that sociologists and economists are scrambling to understand. There are specific counties stretching from the tech corridors of Austin, Texas, to the vast retirement communities of Maricopa County, Arizona, where the statistical likelihood of a marriage ending in dissolution has completely defied traditional predictive models. We are going to explore why a seemingly prosperous relocation to the Sun Belt is one of the highest risk factors for a previously stable marriage. We will examine the sheer isolation of the modern southwestern suburb, where extreme summer temperatures and car-dependent infrastructure sever traditional community support networks, leaving couples entirely dependent on each other in a vacuum. When the economic stress of inflated housing costs meets this geographic isolation, the historical trends show a devastating spike in marital collapse. Furthermore, we must address the methodology of the data itself. To truly understand this, we cannot rely on the crude divorce rate, which simply measures the number of divorces per 1,000 total people in a population, including children and unmarried individuals. That metric is inherently flawed and easily manipulated by rapid population growth. Instead, we must dive into the refined divorce rate, examining the number of divorces per 1,000 married women. When you apply this rigorous lens to the Southwest, the data reveals a startling narrative. We are seeing unprecedented shifts in the gray divorce demographic, particularly in states like Arizona and New Mexico, where retirees are arriving to spend their golden years, only to find themselves unraveling decades-long partnerships. We are seeing the profound impact of the tech boom in states like Texas and Utah, where sudden massive disparities in wealth and the grueling hours of the modern knowledge economy are tearing at the fabric of dual-income households. This brings us to exactly what this masterclass will solve for you today. Whether you currently live in the Southwest, are planning to relocate there, or are simply trying to understand the trajectory of the modern American family, this data is your roadmap. You might wonder why the intimate details of family court dockets in Nevada or Texas should matter to you. The answer is deeply rooted in the economic reality of the United States. Divorce is not just an emotional event, it is a macroeconomic catalyst. When one household fractures into two, it immediately doubles the demand for housing, fundamentally altering local real estate markets and driving up rent prices. It shifts tax brackets, reallocates wealth, and changes the labor force participation rate. By deconstructing these historical trends and examining specific regional case studies, we are going to decode the invisible forces shaping our society. You will learn how to read the demographic warning signs that precede economic shifts in your own community. You will gain a comprehensive understanding of how state-level legislation, from community property laws in Texas to the lack of alimony permanence in other states, dictates the survival or destruction of generational wealth. We are moving far beyond the simple question of why people split up. We are exploring the architectural design of modern society, the psychological toll of the American relocation dream, and the stark financial realities that await when the frontier promise meets the hard edge of the law. This is a meticulous, data-driven journey into the heart of the American Southwest, and by the time we finish mapping out these complex socioeconomic vectors, you will view the institution of marriage, the real estate market, and the very concept of community through an entirely different lens. Let us examine the psychological phenomenon known to family law professionals as the geographic cure. This is the persistent human belief that changing one's physical location will magically resolve internal or relational conflicts. Imagine it is early 2026. Meet David and Emily. They represent a composite of the exact demographic driving the massive population shifts into the Sunbelt. They are a dual-income couple in their late 30s. For the past decade, they lived in a dense, older neighborhood in the Midwest. They had a built-in, robust support system. Grandparents were a short drive away. They had lifelong friends who served as an informal safety net, providing emergency childcare, emotional venting outlets, and regular social interaction. But the property taxes in their Midwestern state were suffocating, the economic growth was stagnant, and the winters were notoriously brutal. They fall victim to the highly marketed Southwestern dream. Driven by targeted online content showcasing endless sunshine and expansive square footage, they decide to execute the geographic cure. They sell their modest home and purchase a massive newly built property in a sprawling master-planned community in Maricopa County, Arizona, or perhaps Collin County, Texas. On paper, it appears to be a massive upward mobility upgrade. They now possess a 4-bedroom house, a private pool, aggressive central air conditioning, and a significantly lower state income tax burden. They believe they have successfully optimized their lifestyle. But historical trends and demographic tracking show us that the physical architecture of this specific dream often lays the concrete foundation for relational collapse. To understand the statistical spike in Southwestern divorces, we must analyze the concept of infrastructural isolation. In their previous life, domestic and emotional stress was widely distributed across a community network. In the rapidly expanding exurbs of the Southwest, that entire network evaporates overnight. The physical environment of these new boomtowns plays a massive unseen role in marital stability. The modern Southwest is uniquely car-dependent and built on a scale that fundamentally discourages pedestrian interaction. You do not walk to a local coffee shop or bump into a neighbor at a corner store. You drive 20 minutes on a 6-lane arterial road to reach a massive commercial plaza. Furthermore, during the brutal summer months, when temperatures consistently exceed 110 degrees, residents experience what sociologists term thermal isolation. Families are forced to retreat into their air-conditioned homes for months at a time. The organic, spontaneous interactions with neighbors that slowly build community cohesion simply do not occur. David and Emily are essentially living in a luxurious, climate-controlled bunker. When a community support network disappears, the absolute entirety of a person's emotional, psychological, and logistical needs must be met by their spouse alone. This creates a catastrophic, unsustainable load-bearing demand on any partnership. If a child falls ill in 2026, there are no grandparents nearby to step in. It immediately forces a high-stress negotiation between David and Emily over who must sacrifice a critical workday, sparking resentment and financial anxiety. If one spouse feels professionally unfulfilled, depressed, or simply lonely in this new environment, the other spouse must suddenly bear the sole burden of acting as the therapist, the best friend, the career counselor, and the crisis manager. Sociological studies tracking interstate migration patterns frequently note that couples who relocate away from their established extended family networks experience a sharp, measurable increase in marital dissatisfaction within the first 36 months of the move. In the specific context of the Southwest, this danger is heavily amplified by the sheer scale of the ongoing migration. We are looking at entirely new cities and sprawling subdivisions populated almost exclusively by recent transplants. Everyone is new. Everyone is disconnected. Everyone is isolated. There is no deeply rooted community fabric for these new arrivals to weave themselves into. Now, we must layer the intense economic realities of 2026 over this emotional isolation. The primary marketing pitch for the American Southwest has always been affordability. But the massive unchecked influx of remote workers, corporate headquarters relocations, and institutional real estate investors has fundamentally altered the financial dynamics of the region. David and Emily likely purchased their dream house at the absolute zenith of a localized housing boom. Their property taxes, while nominally lower in percentage than their previous state, are now assessed on a wildly inflated, multi-million-dollar home value. Simultaneously, the hidden, hyperlocal costs of southwestern living begin to rapidly deplete their monthly budget. The aggressive utility bills required to keep a 3,000-square-foot house cooled for 8 months of the year are staggering. The strict necessity of owning, fueling, and maintaining 2 late-model vehicles, because public transit is virtually non-existent in these vast exurbs, adds thousands of dollars to their annual overhead. The cost of water, a rapidly depleting resource in the desert, has surged. They moved to reduce their overall anxiety, but they merely traded one set of known pressures for an entirely new, unpredictable set of financial burdens, all while intentionally stripping away the very coping mechanisms and support networks that sustained their marriage in the past. This toxic combination of geographic isolation and unexpected financial leverage is precisely where the statistical spike in the data originates. The localized datasets pouring out of family courts in these booming Sunbelt counties reveal a highly distinct pattern of dissolution among couples married between 7 and 12 years, which is the exact demographic leading this current migration wave. But this extreme vulnerability is absolutely not limited to young, dual-income professionals. We must dramatically shift our focus to another massive demographic force, reshaping the Southwestern statistics. Consider the phenomenon of the gray divorce. Let us look at Robert and Linda, age 65, who recently relocated to a massive, gated active adult community in southern Nevada. They have successfully survived 40 years of marriage by maintaining parallel, highly structured lives, sustained by their respective long-term careers, distinct individual social circles, and the decades-long shared project of raising children. Retirement fundamentally strips all of that external structure away. Relocating to a secluded desert community strips it away even further. Suddenly, Robert and Linda are staring at each other across a granite kitchen island, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with absolutely no distractions and no buffering routines. The historical trends regarding gray divorce are frankly staggering and warrant serious attention. Since the late 1990s, the divorce rate among Americans over the age of 50 has essentially doubled, defying the overall national downward trend. In states like Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico, where active retirement communities are densely concentrated, the local family courts are completely inundated with complex asset dissolution cases involving fixed-income seniors and heavily depleted retirement accounts. The potential outcomes in these specific scenarios are financially devastating. When a couple divorces at 65 in the year 2026, there are simply no prime earning years left on the clock to recover from the sudden, brutal halving of a lifelong nest egg. The resulting division of assets often forces both individuals out of the very retirement dream they moved there to achieve, pushing them back into the labor force or into shared housing scenarios. So the systemic pressure continues to build across all demographics. The thermal and geographical isolation firmly sets in. The harsh financial realities of the modern frontier bite down hard. Eventually, the resentment peaks and one spouse makes the quiet, solitary, and life-altering decision to consult a local family law attorney. And it is at this exact critical moment, when the slow emotional collapse of a household officially transitions into a rigidly defined legal process, that the specific geography of the Southwest transforms from a mere psychological trap into a highly complex, unforgiving financial labyrinth. Because when David and Emily or Robert and Linda finally sign and file those dissolution papers, they are going to run headfirst into a legal framework that is entirely unique to this specific region of the United States. A legal framework deeply rooted in laws dating all the way back to Spanish colonial rule, designed to treat a marriage not simply as a romantic partnership, but as a rigid, indivisible economic enterprise. What exactly happens to the inflated house, the massive debt, and the crucial retirement accounts when you attempt to dissolve a marriage in a state that fundamentally disagrees with the rest of the country on who owns what? To understand this regional legal phenomenon, you must first recognize that the United States is essentially split into two entirely different systems of marital property law. The vast majority of the country, 41 states encompassing the East Coast, the Midwest, and the Pacific Northwest, operates under a system derived from English common law known as equitable distribution. In these states, if a marriage dissolves, a judge looks at a wide variety of factors such as the length of the marriage, the earning capacity of each spouse, and individual financial contributions to decide what constitutes a fair division of assets. Fair does not necessarily mean equal, it means equitable. But the American Southwest, deeply influenced by its history of Spanish and Mexican colonial rule, operates under a profoundly different legal doctrine known as community property. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Nevada are all strict community property states. For the millions of Americans migrating from places like New York or Illinois to the Sun Belt, this legal framework represents a massive, often completely unanticipated financial shock. Under community property law, the fundamental assumption is that marriage is a strict economic partnership, effectively a 50-50 corporate merger. Almost every single asset acquired, and every single dollar earned by either spouse from the exact date of the marriage to the date of legal separation, is considered equally owned by both parties. It absolutely does not matter whose name is on the paycheck. It does not matter whose name is on the deed to the house or the title to the vehicle. It does not matter if one spouse worked 80 hours a week building a medical practice while the other spouse stayed home. In the eyes of the Southwestern family courts, both spouses contributed equally to the community estate, and therefore the community estate is divided equally down the middle. Imagine if it is the current year 2026 and we are looking at the case of Christopher and Amanda. They are a highly successful couple who recently relocated from Boston, an equitable distribution jurisdiction, to Austin, Texas. Christopher is an executive at a rapidly expanding tech firm, while Amanda has chosen to manage the household and volunteer locally. During their first 4 years in Texas, Christopher's aggressive compensation package, heavily weighted in restricted stock units and performance bonuses, skyrockets in value. In Massachusetts, a judge might weigh Christopher's direct contribution to acquiring that specific wealth if they were to divorce. In Texas, the law is blind to his individual effort. The moment they file for dissolution, half of the value of those stock units, half of the bonuses earned during the marriage, and half of the retirement contributions made since the wedding day belong unconditionally to Amanda. The potential outcomes of this strict division are frequently devastating for small business owners and entrepreneurs who flock to the Southwest for its business-friendly climate. If a spouse starts a company during the marriage in a state like Nevada or Arizona, that business is a community asset. Upon divorce, a forensic accountant must be hired to determine the exact market value of the enterprise. The founding spouse is then legally obligated to buy out the other spouse for 50% of that total valuation. Because most small businesses do not hold massive cash reserves, this rigid requirement often forces the founder to liquidate business assets, take on crippling commercial debt at high interest rates, or sell the company entirely just to satisfy the divorce decree. The geographic relocation meant to foster their business growth ultimately becomes the legal mechanism that dismantles it. But the truly terrifying aspect of the community property system is not just the equal division of wealth, it is the equal division of liability. The law treats community debt exactly the same as community assets. If one spouse acquires a massive financial burden during the marriage, both spouses are generally held entirely responsible for its repayment, regardless of who signed the loan documents or swiped the credit card. Consider the hypothetical scenario of James and Sarah, living in the sprawling suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona. Unbeknownst to Sarah, James develops a severe gambling addiction or perhaps engages in highly speculative, leveraged cryptocurrency trading that collapses catastrophically. He quietly accumulates hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest personal loans and credit card debt. When the financial pressure finally causes the marriage to implode, Sarah is horrified to discover the extent of the financial ruin. Under the strict doctrines of the Southwest, because this debt was accrued during the timeline of the marriage, it is classified as a community obligation. Creditors can, and frequently do, aggressively pursue Sarah for the repayment of loans she never authorized, targeting her separate bank accounts and her half of the home equity. This brings us to the single largest battleground in modern Southwestern divorce proceedings, which is the family home. The current economic environment of 2026 has transformed the division of real estate from a standard legal procedure into a financial nightmare. During the pandemic housing boom, millions of couples secured mortgages at historically low interest rates hovering around 3%. If a couple in New Mexico or Texas divorces today, the court mandates that they divide the equity in the home equally. One spouse must buy the other out. However, to execute that buyout, the spouse keeping the house must refinance the entire mortgage in their name alone. In the economic landscape of 2026, refinancing means surrendering that ultra-low interest rate and taking on a new mortgage at current market rates, which might be double the original percentage. Suddenly, the monthly payment on the exact same house becomes completely unaffordable on a single income. The historical trends show that this specific mathematical trap is forcing an unprecedented number of divorcing couples in the Sunbelt to sell their dream homes entirely, liquidating the property, paying massive capital gains taxes, and re-entering a brutal rental market with only half of their original wealth. Even premarital assets are not entirely safe from the reach of these regional courts. When transplants arrive in the Southwest, they frequently sell a home they owned prior to the marriage and use those funds as a down payment on a new joint property. This triggers a complex legal concept known as commingling. If a spouse cannot meticulously trace the origin of every single dollar used in that transaction through a labyrinth of bank statements, the court will presume those funds have been permanently mixed into the community estate. A home fully paid for by one person a decade ago can suddenly mutate into a shared asset simply because the funds were temporarily parked in a joint checking account in Las Vegas. The division of past assets and liabilities is a grueling, mathematically precise stripping of wealth. But as traumatic as the property division may be, it only addresses the history of the marriage. Once the house is sold, the retirement accounts are slashed in half, and the debt is distributed. The divorcing individuals must face the horrifying reality of their future survival. And it is in this exact transition from dividing past wealth to demanding future financial support, where the laws of the Southwest reveal their most brutal, unsympathetic edge. When a spouse who sacrificed their career to raise a family in an isolated desert suburb finally asks the court for ongoing financial assistance, they are about to run headfirst into a legal system that has essentially declared war on the very concept of permanent alimony. For decades, the national understanding of divorce included a foundational safety net designed to protect the most financially vulnerable partner. In the mid-20th century, if one spouse abandoned their individual earning potential to manage the domestic sphere, the courts widely recognized a moral and legal obligation for the primary breadwinner to maintain that spouse's standard of living indefinitely. But the modern legal architecture of the American Southwest has systematically dismantled this paradigm. The frontier ethos of individualism and self-sufficiency has deeply permeated the family court systems in states like Texas, Arizona, and Nevada. In these jurisdictions, the fundamental legal presumption in the year 2026 is that every adult is entirely responsible for their own economic survival immediately following the dissolution of a marriage. The courts no longer view alimony as a lifelong pension for domestic service. Instead, they view it strictly as a temporary, heavily scrutinized bridge meant solely to prevent a former spouse from becoming a ward of the state. This is known as rehabilitative maintenance, and securing it requires a grueling legal battle. To fully grasp the severity of this shift, we must examine the specific statutory limitations that govern these potential outcomes. Texas stands as the most aggressive example of this anti-alimony philosophy. In the Texas Family Code, the concept of permanent alimony effectively does not exist outside of extreme cases involving severe physical or mental disability. Instead, the state offers what is called spousal maintenance, and the barriers to entry are astonishingly high. To even be legally eligible to request this support in Texas, the spouse seeking financial assistance must prove that they lack sufficient property to provide for their minimum reasonable needs, and crucially, they must have been married for a continuous period of at least 10 years. If a marriage collapses at the 9-year and 11-month mark, the dependent spouse is legally barred from receiving a single dollar of post-divorce maintenance based on the duration of the marriage, regardless of the wealth accumulated by the primary earner. Imagine if it is 2026 and we analyze the case study of William and Elizabeth. They live in a highly affluent suburb of Houston. William is a senior petroleum engineer pulling in a massive corporate salary, while Elizabeth has spent the last 12 years entirely outside the workforce, raising their 3 children and managing their complex domestic life. Under the laws of an East Coast state, Elizabeth might expect an alimony award that equalizes their post-divorce incomes for a significant duration, potentially indefinitely. But in Texas, she hits a brutal, uncompromising statutory ceiling. Even if Elizabeth successfully proves to a judge that she cannot meet her minimum reasonable needs, Texas law aggressively caps the maximum amount of spousal maintenance she can receive. As of current legal frameworks, the absolute maximum award is strictly capped at either $5,000 per month or 20% of the paying spouse's average monthly gross income, whichever is less. Therefore, even if William is earning $40,000 a month, Elizabeth will never receive more than $5,000. In the heavily inflated, post-pandemic housing market of Houston in 2026, $5,000 barely covers the rent, utilities, and groceries for a family of 4, let alone replacing the lifestyle she experienced during the marriage. Furthermore, this support is temporary. For a marriage lasting between 10 and 20 years, the absolute maximum duration of support is capped at 5 years. The clock starts ticking the moment the gavel falls. Elizabeth is given a rigid 60-month runway to completely reinvent herself, update her decade-old skill set, and re-enter a hyper-competitive, technologically advanced workforce, all while managing the profound emotional trauma of a family collapse. This brings us to the devastating legal mechanism utilized across the entire Southwest to minimize support payments, a concept known as imputed income. In states like Arizona and Nevada, where judges historically had slightly more discretion than in Texas, the courts have increasingly adopted a merciless stance on earning capacity. If Elizabeth claims she can only secure a minimum wage job after her long absence from the corporate world, William's legal team will not simply accept that premise. They will hire a vocational evaluator. This is an expert witness whose sole job is to forensically examine Elizabeth's education, her health, her prior work history from a decade ago, and the current local labor market statistics to determine what she theoretically could be earning if she maximized her efforts. If the vocational expert testifies that Elizabeth holds an inactive real estate license or a dormant degree in graphic design, the judge can legally impute an income to her. The court might decree that Elizabeth is fully capable of earning $60,000 a year, and they will calculate her need for financial support based on that phantom income, regardless of whether she has actually secured a job paying that amount. This creates a terrifying financial cliff. The dependent spouse is legally expected to generate a specific income instantly. If they fail to secure that high-paying role in a highly volatile 2026 economy, the financial shortfall is entirely their own problem. They are forced to rapidly liquidate whatever assets they received in the community property division just to survive, systematically destroying their long-term financial security and their retirement prospects within the first few years of the divorce. The historical trends tracking this demographic transition reveal a massive, localized economic crisis. The family courts of the Southwest are actively producing a rapidly expanding class of newly impoverished, middle-aged individuals. We are seeing thousands of former dependent spouses flooding the gig economy, taking on massive student loan debt late in life to acquire new certifications, and being entirely priced out of the communities where their children attend school. The geographic relocation to the Sunbelt, initially pursued to optimize wealth and reduce taxes, ironically becomes the very mechanism that ensures absolute financial devastation for the lower-earning partner when the marriage breaks. But the stark terror of imputed income and temporary alimony pales in comparison to the leverage it creates in the most volatile arena of the courtroom. When a dependent spouse realizes they are facing an impending financial cliff, they are frequently forced to make agonizing compromises in other areas of the divorce settlement just to secure a small amount of liquid capital upfront. They trade their rights for survival. And the most heartbreaking currency used in these desperate negotiations is not real estate, and it is not retirement accounts. It is the fundamental access to their own family. Because while the division of money is governed by rigid math and strict statutory caps, the laws dictating what happens to the children in a transient, heavily relocated society are incredibly fluid, heavily biased, and about to introduce a level of psychological warfare that makes the financial destruction look like a mere preamble. What happens when a parent, financially ruined by the regional laws, attempts to flee the Southwest and return to the safety of their extended family across state lines? The answer is that they instantly collide with an invisible, legally enforced concrete wall. When a financially devastated parent attempts to escape the crushing economic realities of the Sunbelt and return to their original support network in the Midwest or the East Coast, they trigger one of the most aggressive and unforgiving mechanisms in American family law. This mechanism is governed by a federal framework known as the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act, originally drafted to prevent parental kidnapping across state lines. In the modern era of mass migration to the Southwest, This legislation frequently functions as a permanent geographic cage for the lower-earning spouse. Imagine it is the middle of 2026 and we are observing the case of Sarah and Thomas. 4 years ago, they left their extended families in Ohio to chase a lucrative corporate relocation package in Phoenix, Arizona. The marriage disintegrates under the localized pressures we previously discussed. Sarah, who stepped back from her career to manage the transition and raise their 2 young children, is now staring directly at the devastating financial cliff of temporary rehabilitative maintenance. She does the absolute most logical thing for her survival. She decides to move back to Ohio, where her parents have offered her free housing in their completely paid-off home, along with free childcare, allowing her the breathing room to re-enter the workforce without facing immediate poverty. She packs her belongings, loads the children into the car, and prepares to drive east. Before she even reaches the state line, Thomas files a petition for dissolution of marriage in a Maricopa County courthouse. By doing so, he instantly locks the jurisdiction of the children to the state of Arizona. Because the children have resided in Arizona for the last 6 consecutive months, the federal law unequivocally designates Arizona as their legal home state. Sarah is immediately served with a standard preliminary injunction. This is not a domestic violence restraining order. It is a strict geographic mandate forbidding either parent from removing the children from the state without the explicit written permission of the other parent or a direct order from the judge. If Sarah continues her drive to Ohio, she is no longer simply moving home. She is actively committing a severe felony and virtually guaranteeing that she will be stripped of all custody rights. She is legally forced to turn the car around and return to a hyperinflated real estate market, where she has no family, no job, and no long-term spousal support. If she wishes to leave legally, she must embark on what family law attorneys universally consider the most difficult, expensive, and hostile form of litigation in existence, which is the interstate relocation case. In the courts of the Southwest, the prevailing legal philosophy heavily prioritizes frequent and continuing physical contact with both parents over the individual financial comfort of one parent. To win permission to relocate the children back to Ohio, Sarah cannot simply argue that the cost of living in Arizona is destroying her. The historical trends in these specific courts show that judges routinely reject financial hardship as a primary reason for relocation. Instead, Sarah bears the crushing burden of proving that moving 1,000 miles away is actively in the best interest of the children. She must prove that the schools in Ohio are objectively superior, that the extended family network provides a demonstrably better psychological environment, and that she can somehow facilitate a meaningful relationship between the children and Thomas despite the massive geographic distance. To even attempt to prove this in the year 2026, Sarah cannot rely on her own testimony. She must hire private forensic custody evaluators. These are highly specialized clinical psychologists appointed by the court to interview the parents, observe the children, conduct psychological testing, and issue a formal recommendation to the judge. The cost of a comprehensive forensic evaluation in a contested relocation case frequently exceeds $40,000. This presents a devastating paradox. Sarah is attempting to leave the state precisely because she has no money, yet the legal system demands she produce tens of thousands of dollars in expert witness fees just to secure the permission to leave. If we look at Texas, the geographic containment strategy is even more rigidly institutionalized. Texas family courts are famous for imposing strict domicile restrictions in almost every single custody order involving children. When a couple divorces in the rapidly expanding suburbs of Dallas or Austin, the final decree will typically mandate that the primary residence of the children must remain within the specific county where the divorce occurred, or strictly within the contiguous counties that physically touch its borders. Consider the potential outcomes of this restriction in a high-cost area like Travis County, Texas. If a dependent parent is awarded primary custody but denied long-term spousal maintenance, they are legally ordered to raise those children in one of the most expensive housing markets in the United States. They are effectively trapped in a geographic radius dictated by the court. If the primary earner objects to lifting the geographic restriction, the lower-earning parent is faced with an impossible, agonizing choice. They can choose to remain in the Southwest, financially drowning, perpetually on the edge of eviction, relying on food banks or unstable roommate situations simply to stay within the legally mandated county lines and maintain their daily presence in their children's lives. Or they can make the heartbreaking decision to surrender primary custody. They can agree to leave the children with a higher-earning spouse in the Southwest, secure their own economic survival by returning to their family out of state, and accept the role of a long-distance parent who only sees their children during scheduled summer vacations and alternating holidays. This is the ultimate tragedy of the modern relocation dream. Families move to the frontier seeking freedom and opportunity. But when the household fractures, the localized legal framework constructs an invisible prison. The state demands that the family remain geographically intact for the sake of the children, even while simultaneously ensuring that one half of that family is entirely stripped of the financial resources required to survive in that specific geography. The pressure on the lower-earning parent becomes insurmountable, leading to profound psychological trauma and a radical reshaping of the parent-child dynamic. But for those who manage to stay, who sacrifice everything to remain within the court-ordered county lines of the Sun Belt, the daily reality of raising children under a modern Southwest custody order introduces an entirely new layer of conflict. Because the courts do not merely dictate where you must live, they dictate exactly how many hours of your child's life you are permitted to witness. We must turn our attention to the intense mathematics of possession and access. How do these specific states legally divide the time of a child? What is the exact schedule that governs the lives of millions of fractured families in 2026? And why is the battle over a few extra percentage points of custody tearing these communities apart? The mathematical precision of the Southwestern legal system is perhaps most visible in the standard possession order. While much of the country has moved toward a vague best interests of the child standard that allows for wide judicial discretion, states like Texas and Arizona have codified the division of a child's life into a rigid, repeatable calendar. This is not just a suggestion. It is a legally binding schedule that dictates exactly which parent is responsible for the child at any given minute of the year. In the year 2026, the default baseline for many of these jurisdictions remains the expanded standard possession order. This specific schedule awards the non-custodial parent, often referred to as the possessor conservator, the first, third, and fifth weekends of every month, along with a weeknight visit and a significant block of time in the summer. Imagine if it is a Friday afternoon in 2026. We are following the case of Michael and Jennifer in San Antonio, Texas. Under a standard order, Michael, as the non-custodial parent, is entitled to pick up his children from school on the first, third, and fifth Friday of the month. If a month happens to have 5 Fridays, Michael gets an extra weekend. If the month has only 4, he must wait 2 full weeks between visits. This creates a psychological phenomenon known as the fifth weekend anxiety. For parents who are struggling to maintain a bond across the fractured lines of a divorce, that extra weekend represents a massive statistical shift in their total annual parenting time. To understand the intensity of the conflict, we have to look at the percentages. A traditional standard possession order typically grants the non-custodial parent approximately 35 to 40% of the total overnights in a calendar year. However, in the high-stakes legal environment of the Southwest, there is a massive push for what is known as 50-50 shared parenting. This is a schedule where each parent has exactly 182.5 days per year. The battle for those extra 10 to 15 percentage points of time is rarely just about the emotional bond with the child. In the calculated reality of 2026, those percentage points are directly tied to the calculation of child support payments. Historical trends show that in many Southwestern jurisdictions, if a parent achieves a true 50-50 split of time, the amount of child support they are required to pay can be dramatically reduced or even eliminated entirely through what is called an offset. This creates a perverse incentive structure where parents who may not have been deeply involved in daily caregiving suddenly fight tooth and nail for equal time, not necessarily to parent more, but to protect their remaining income from heavy garnishment. Conversely, the custodial parent, who is often struggling with the financial cliff we discussed earlier, may fight to keep the non-custodial parent at the 40% mark to ensure the full child support payment remains intact for the household budget. The child becomes a literal pawn in a high-stakes game of fiscal survival. Let us look at the case study of Robert and Elena in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Robert is an engineer, and Elena has been a stay-at-home mother. During their divorce in 2026, Robert's legal team aggressively pursues a week-on week-off schedule. This means the children spend 7 days at Robert's apartment and then 7 days at Elena's. On the surface, this sounds like the pinnacle of fairness. But consider the logistical nightmare of the Southwestern infrastructure. If Robert moved 25 miles away to find an affordable apartment while Elena stayed in the family home to keep the children in their current school district, the children are now spending over 10 hours a week in a car just to facilitate this equal split. The thermal and geographic isolation we discussed earlier now applies to the children. In the searing heat of a New Mexico summer, These children are being shuffled back and forth between two distinct households, often with different rules, different social circles, and entirely different economic realities. This is what sociologists call the binuclear family, but in the Southwest, it is a binuclear family separated by a vast, car-dependent wasteland. The psychological toll on the children is documented in longitudinal studies, showing increased levels of executive function stress. These children must constantly track which house has their soccer cleats, which house has their laptop charger, and which parent is responsible for their medication on a Tuesday versus a Wednesday. Furthermore, the 2026 legal landscape has introduced the concept of right of first refusal into almost every decree. This clause mandates that if a parent is unable to be with the child for a period of more than, say, 4 or 8 hours during their scheduled time, they must offer the other parent the opportunity to take the child before calling a babysitter or a grandparent. While this was intended to maximize parental time, it has evolved into a tool for digital surveillance and harassment. Imagine Jennifer in San Antonio receives a notification from Michael's social media, showing him at a professional conference. She immediately files a motion claiming he violated the right of first refusal by leaving the children with his new girlfriend. The legal fees for this single motion can easily exceed $5,000, further draining the community assets that were already halved in the property division. This leads to a phenomenon unique to the sprawling metroplexes of the Southwest, the satellite parent. Because the housing market in 2026 is so prohibitively expensive, the non-custodial parent is often forced to live in a much smaller, less desirable area far from the children's school. When it is their weekend, they are essentially hosting the children in a transitional space that never truly feels like home. The children spend their weekends in a bedroom filled with half-unpacked boxes, away from their neighborhood friends and their extracurricular activities. This geographic disconnect frequently leads to a gradual erosion of the relationship, where the non-custodial parent eventually settles into the role of the fun weekend parent who provides entertainment but avoids the difficult, daily labor of discipline, homework, and routine. But what happens when the 2026 economy shifts again? In the Southwest, the industry is heavily tied to energy, tech, and defense. If Michael loses his job in San Antonio and finds a new opportunity in Dallas, he is now 300 miles away. The standard possession order contains a provision for this, the 100-mile rule. If the parents live more than 100 miles apart, the schedule shifts drastically. The non-custodial parent loses their weeknight visits and potentially some of their weekends in exchange for more time in the summer and every single spring break. This distance effectively ends the possibility of shared parenting and places the entire burden of daily life on one parent, while the other becomes a distant figure. The potential outcomes for the children are stark. They grow up in a state of perpetual transition, their lives dictated by the odometer of a car and the strict language of a court order drafted years prior. The battle for the child's time, originally framed as a pursuit of fairness, often concludes as a war of attrition where the parent with the most stamina and the most liquid capital for legal fees eventually dictates the terms of the relationship. As we move forward in this deep dive, we must look at the final, most permanent consequence of this legal and geographic pressure cooker. We have seen the financial destruction, the geographic entrapment, and the rigid division of time. But there is a silent, growing trend in the 2026 statistics that points to something even more radical. An increasing number of people are looking at this entire system, the community property traps, the alimony cliffs, and the custody wars, and they are deciding to bypass it entirely. They are opting for a different kind of domestic arrangement that avoids the court system altogether. But as they will soon discover in the Southwest, even if you never sign a marriage license, the law has a way of finding you and imposing its will on your life through a doctrine that many people believe died out a century ago. How can you be legally married in Texas or Arizona without ever saying I do? And what does that mean for your bank account when that relationship ends? In the year 2026, many couples in the booming tech hubs of the Southwest believe they have discovered a sophisticated loophole to avoid the legal traps of the community property system. They decide to cohabitate indefinitely without ever obtaining a formal marriage license. They keep their bank accounts separate, they split the rent on their high-rise apartments in Scottsdale or Austin, and they tell themselves that because they never said I do in front of a judge or a religious official, they are shielded from the brutal asset division we have been discussing. However, they are often blindsided by a legal doctrine that is still very much alive and well in the state of Texas: the informal marriage, more commonly known as common law marriage. While many states abolished this concept decades ago, The Texas Family Code remains one of the few jurisdictions in the developed world where a marriage can be legally established through conduct alone, without a single piece of paper from the county clerk. To understand the gravity of this, imagine the case of Marcus and Sophia living in the year 2026. Marcus is a high-earning software architect who moved to Dallas from California. Sophia is a freelance consultant. They have lived together for 7 years. They never had a wedding. They never applied for a license. But they have shared a life that, to the outside world, looks exactly like a marriage. In the eyes of Texas law, if 3 specific criteria are met simultaneously, Marcus and Sophia are not just a couple living together. They are legally, fully, and irreversibly married. These 3 pillars are: first, that they agreed to be married; second, that after the agreement they lived together in Texas as spouses; and third, that they represented to others that they were married. The third pillar, representing to others, is where the statistical trap usually snaps shut in 2026. This is often referred to as holding out. In a modern, digitally connected society, holding out is no longer just about how you introduce someone at a dinner party. It is forensically documented in every social media post, every joint lease application, and every insurance policy. If Marcus listed Sophia as his spouse on a health insurance enrollment form to save on premiums, or if Sophia referred to Marcus as her husband in a public Facebook post that Marcus liked or commented on, a Texas family court judge can find that they held themselves out as married. There is no minimum time requirement. It does not take 7 years or even 7 months. If those 3 elements exist for a single day, the informal marriage is established. The potential outcomes of an informal marriage finding are identical to those of a formal, high-budget wedding at a cathedral. The moment a judge declares that an informal marriage existed, the community property laws we analyzed earlier apply retroactively to the start of the relationship. This means that Marcus's stock options, his 401k contributions, and the appreciation of the home they lived in, even if it was in his name only, are suddenly subject to a 50-50 split. In 2026, we are seeing a massive spike in what attorneys call the defensive divorce. This occurs when one partner in a long-term cohabitation realizes the relationship is ending and rushes to court to file for a divorce from a marriage the other partner didn't even realize they were in. They are not filing for a divorce to end the relationship. They are filing to prove the marriage existed, so they can claim their half of the community estate. While Arizona officially abolished the creation of new common-law marriages within its borders in the mid-20th century, the state still recognizes valid common-law marriages created in other states like Texas. If Marcus and Sophia lived in Dallas as an informal couple and then relocated to Phoenix, the Arizona courts will honor that Texas status. This creates a cross-border legal nightmare. Furthermore, even in states without common-law marriage, the 2026 legal landscape is increasingly dealing with the concept of palimony or breach of contract claims between unmarried cohabitants. The historical trends show that as marriage rates decline, the litigation surrounding the breakup of long-term unmarried couples is becoming just as expensive and just as invasive as traditional divorce. Now, let us examine the specific financial weapon used to navigate these informal and formal minefields: the premarital agreement. In the Southwest of 2026, the prenup has moved from a tool of the ultra-wealthy to a standard requirement for middle-class professionals and retirees. Because the community property laws are so rigid, a premarital agreement is the only legal mechanism available to opt out of the state's default settings. However, the standards for enforcing these agreements in the Southwest are incredibly high, and the potential for them to be tossed out by a judge is a constant source of legal anxiety. Consider the case study of Elena and David. Before marrying in Nevada, David, who owned a successful landscaping business, insisted on a premarital agreement to protect his company. In 2026, they are divorcing, and Elena's legal team is moving to set the agreement aside. To be enforceable in a state like Nevada or Texas, the agreement must have been signed voluntarily, and there must have been a full and fair disclosure of all assets and liabilities. If David failed to disclose a single dormant bank account or undervalued his business equipment by a significant margin, the entire document can be declared unconscionable. The historical trends show that judges are increasingly skeptical of agreements signed under duress, such as an agreement presented to a spouse just days before the wedding ceremony. The 2026 statistics reveal that even with a valid premarital agreement, couples in the Southwest often accidentally nullify their own protections through the process of commingling, which we touched on earlier but must now analyze with forensic detail. Imagine David keeps his business income in a separate account as mandated by his prenup. However, during a lean month, he uses $5,000 from that separate account to pay the mortgage on the family home. Or conversely, he uses a joint tax refund to pay the property taxes on his separate business warehouse. The moment separate funds and community funds touch, the separate property is infected. In the high-volume, fast-paced family courts of the Southwest, if a spouse cannot provide a clean, unbroken paper trail of every cent for the duration of a 10-year marriage, the court will default to the community property presumption. The prenup becomes a worthless piece of paper because the assets it was meant to protect have been legally dissolved into the community bucket. This leads us to the most complex demographic in this data set, the multi-state family. In 2026, the American workforce is more mobile than ever. We are seeing thousands of cases where a couple married in a common law state like New York lived in a community property state like Texas for 5 years, and then filed for divorce while one spouse was temporarily working in a third state. The legal term for this is quasi-community property. It is a mathematical labyrinth where a judge must look at assets acquired in other states and determine how they would have been classified if the couple had lived in the Southwest the entire time. The sheer exhaustion of these legal battles, the fight over whether an informal marriage existed, the struggle to enforce or break a prenup, and the forensic tracing of commingled funds, leads to a massive unseen cost. In 2026, the average contested divorce in a major southwestern metro area can easily consume between $50,000 and $150,000 in legal and expert fees per spouse. This is money that is liquidated directly from the family's net worth, paid to a small army of attorneys, accountants, and appraisers. We are witnessing the systematic incineration of the American middle class's wealth, one divorce decree at a time. But as the financial resources dwindle and the legal battle reaches its peak, the conflict often takes a dark, psychological turn. When the money is gone and the house is sold, the only thing left to fight over is the narrative. In the next part of this masterclass, we must address the ultimate escalation in Southwestern divorce statistics. We are going to look at the rise of high-conflict litigation, the weaponization of the mental health profession in the courtroom, and the disturbing trend of parental alienation that is leaving a permanent scar on the next generation of Sunbelt residents. How does the 2026 legal system respond when one parent decides that the only way to win the divorce is to ensure the children never want to see the other parent again? The transition from financial litigation to psychological warfare marks the most volatile phase of a Southwestern dissolution. In the year 2026, the term high-conflict divorce has moved from a clinical descriptor to a standard classification within the dockets of Clark County, Nevada, and Harris County, Texas. When the community property has been exhausted by legal fees and the real estate has been liquidated, the focus shifts toward the ultimate intangible asset, the psychological loyalty of the children. This is where we encounter the devastating phenomenon of parental alienation, a strategy of emotional gatekeeping that historical trends show is becoming increasingly prevalent in the isolated, high-stress environments of the Sunbelt exurbs. Imagine the case of Daniel and Monica in a rapidly growing master-planned community outside of Las Vegas. Their divorce has been characterized by 3 years of litigation. Monica, who feels deep resentment over the financial limitations of the Nevada alimony statutes, begins a subtle but systematic campaign to reshape the children's perception of Daniel. This is not achieved through overt screaming matches. In 2026, parental alienation is conducted through a process of sophisticated emotional enmeshment and digital manipulation. Monica begins by sharing adult legal details with the children, framing the father as the sole reason for their sudden drop in lifestyle. She refers to the house they lost as the house your father took away from us. Over months, this evolves into a psychological phenomenon known as the campaign of denigration. The child, seeking to maintain their primary emotional bond with the custodial parent in an isolated environment where they have few other support systems, begins to mirror that parent's hostility. In the Southwest, where thermal isolation often keeps children indoors and glued to devices, this alienation is amplified through restricted digital access. Monica might block Daniel's number on the children's tablets or monitor their private messages, creating a climate where any positive interaction with the non-custodial parent is viewed as a betrayal of the household. The potential outcomes for the target parent are catastrophic. Daniel finds himself in a situation where his children, whom he coached in soccer just a year prior, suddenly refuse to attend his scheduled weekend visits. They cite vague, scripted reasons. They claim they are afraid of him, or that his new, smaller apartment makes them uncomfortable. In the year 2026, The Southwestern legal system responds to this through the appointment of an amicus attorney or a guardian ad litem. This is a private lawyer appointed by the court specifically to represent the best interests of the child, but who is paid for by the parents. The historical trends in these cases show a staggering increase in the use of reunification therapy. This is a court-ordered clinical intervention where a specialized therapist attempts to repair the fractured bond between the alienated parent and the child. However, in the high-demand markets of Phoenix and Austin, the waitlist for a qualified reunification therapist can be 6 months long. During those 6 months, the alienation deepens, and the child's resistance hardens. By the time the first session occurs, the damage is often permanent. Furthermore, the cost of these therapists, which is not covered by insurance because it is court-mandated, can range from $300 to $500 per hour. We must also analyze the weaponization of the mental health profession through the use of parent coordinators. These are third-party professionals, often former attorneys or social workers, who are given quasi-judicial power to settle daily disputes between high-conflict parents. In 2026, if Daniel and Monica cannot agree on which summer camp the children should attend or whether a child can get a haircut, they must go to the parent coordinator. Every email, every phone call, and every disagreement is billed at an hourly rate. We are seeing a new economic subsector in the Southwest built entirely on the inability of divorced couples to communicate, effectively creating a tax on high-conflict behavior that further drains the children's future college funds. The 2026 data also points to an alarming trend in the filing of protective orders as a tactical maneuver in custody battles. While domestic violence is a grave and serious reality that the court must protect against, legal analysts in the Southwest have noted a statistical spike in temporary restraining orders filed precisely 48 hours before a major custody hearing. In states like Texas, a finding of family violence can result in a rebuttable presumption against joint conservatorship. This means that an unproven allegation, even if later dismissed, can give one parent a massive, multi-month advantage in controlling the narrative and the physical possession of the children. The legal system, designed to be a shield for the vulnerable, is increasingly being manipulated into a sword for the litigious. But why is this happening with such intensity in this specific region? To understand the psychology, we must return to the concept of the transient population. In the Southwest, people often lack the cooling influence of a long-term community. In the Midwest, a divorcing couple might be shamed into better behavior by their shared church, their longtime neighbors, or their extended family who have known both parties for 20 years. In the brand new subdivisions of the Sun Belt, there are no shared roots. There is no social cost to high-conflict behavior because there is no established social fabric to witness it. The divorce becomes a private war conducted in a vacuum of accountability. This leads to the final stage of the high-conflict cycle, the scorched earth policy. When one or both parents realize that the legal system cannot actually force the other person to be a good co-parent, they pivot toward total obstruction. They file endless motions for contempt over minor issues, such as a child being returned 15 minutes late from a visit. They subpoena the other parent's employer, their new significant other, and their medical records. The goal is no longer to win a better schedule. The goal is the total financial and social liquidation of the former spouse. In 2026, we are witnessing the long-term results of this environment on the first generation of children raised entirely within the Sun Belt's high-conflict legal machine. These children are showing significantly higher rates of adult-onset anxiety and a profound skepticism toward the institution of marriage themselves. They have seen their parents' wealth incinerated by the state, and their own childhoods converted into a series of billable hours for forensic experts. The statistics of divorce in the Southwest are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They are a map of a structural failure. We have created an environment that encourages migration, rewards individual accumulation, and then provides a legal framework that punishes the failure of a partnership with absolute severity. But as we look toward the final parts of this deep dive, we have to ask, is there a way out? Is there a burgeoning movement in 2026 that is attempting to bypass this entire adversarial system? We are going to look at the rise of private, binding arbitration, and the secretive world of collaborative law, where couples are attempting to take the power back from the state. But as they are finding, even in the shadows of private law, the ghost of community property still haunts every signature. What happens when the most private negotiations are leaked? And can you truly ever outrun the reach of a Texas or Arizona family court judge? The reality of 2026 is that the traditional courtroom is no longer the only theater of war for Southwestern divorces. as the public dockets in counties like Maricopa and Tarrant become overwhelmed with the sheer volume of filings from the ongoing migration wave, a shadowy, parallel legal system has emerged. This is the world of private binding arbitration and collaborative law. These are advertised as the civilized alternatives to the public humiliation of a trial, but as many high-net-worth couples are discovering, these private paths contain their own unique set of hazards that can be just as financially devastating as a public blowout. Imagine the scenario of Kevin and Isabella, a couple in their late 50s living in a high-end development in Summerlin, Nevada. Kevin is a partner in a private equity firm, and Isabella has managed their extensive real estate portfolio. They decide to opt for collaborative law to keep their financial details out of the public record. In a collaborative process, both parties and their respective attorneys sign a contract stating they will not go to court. They agree to full transparency, sharing every bank statement and tax return in a series of four-way meetings. The incentive is high. If the collaborative process fails and one party decides to sue, both attorneys are legally required to withdraw from the case, and the couple must start over from scratch with entirely new legal teams, effectively flushing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees down the drain. This creates a high-pressure environment known as the collaborative trap. Because the cost of failure is so high, the parties are often coerced into settlements they do not fully agree with just to avoid the total loss of their initial investment. In Kevin and Isabella's case, they spent 18 months in the collaborative bubble, paying not just for 2 sets of attorneys, but for a neutral financial professional and a communication coach. In the year 2026, the historical trends show that while collaborative law can reduce emotional trauma for some, for others, it becomes a marathon of billable hours where no one is willing to make the first move toward a compromise because the stakes of walking away are too high. But what happens when the private negotiations are completed, the ink is dry on the settlement, and then the leak occurs? In our digitally saturated 2026 landscape, privacy is a fragile illusion. Even in private arbitration, where a retired judge is hired for $10,000 a day to act as a private court, the final orders must still be filed with the state to be enforceable. If Kevin and Isabella's private arbitrator makes a ruling on the division of their international holdings, that ruling eventually touches a public clerk's office. If a disgruntled former employee of the law firm or a sophisticated data scraper accesses these files, the most intimate details of their wealth and their family's fracturing are suddenly available for the world to see. Furthermore, you can never truly outrun the reach of a Southwestern family court judge because of the principle of continuing exclusive jurisdiction. If a judge in Arizona issues a child support order in 2026, that judge retains control over that order as long as one of the parties or the child remains in the state. You cannot simply move to a more lenient state and ask a new judge to change the rules. If Isabella moves to Florida to escape the Arizona heat, she is still tethered to the Phoenix courtroom for any modifications to her support or custody. The reach of the Southwestern law is long, and its memory is permanent. Let us look at the forensic reality of what happens when these private negotiations go sour. In the Southwest, there is a growing trend of using private investigators and digital forensics experts to audit the lifestyle of a former spouse who claims they cannot afford support. In 2026, your digital footprint is your biggest liability. Imagine if Kevin claims his private equity returns have dipped, but his social media metadata or his Tesla's GPS history shows him frequenting high-end resorts or making luxury purchases. In a community property state, if he used community funds to maintain a lifestyle after the date of separation but before the divorce was final, he is guilty of what the law calls waste. The concept of waste of community assets is a powerful legal weapon. If a spouse can prove that the other partner spent money on a new partner, on gambling, or on unnecessary luxury items while the divorce was pending, the court can award a disproportionate share of the remaining assets to the innocent spouse to make them whole. This leads to a level of surveillance that is unprecedented. In the sprawling suburbs of the Southwest, where every toll road camera, every smart doorbell, and every digital transaction is logged, there is nowhere to hide. The historical trends show that in 2026, more divorces are settled based on digital evidence of financial waste than on any other single factor. We must also address the rise of the gray market of divorce funding, because the legal fees in these deep dive cases are so high. A new industry of litigation funders has emerged. These are companies that will pay for your high-priced Southwestern attorney in exchange for a percentage of your final settlement. This turns the divorce into a literal investment vehicle for third parties. Imagine if Isabella, lacking liquid cash but knowing she is entitled to half of a $50 million estate, takes a $500,000 loan from a funding firm. The funding firm now has a vested interest in Isabella's case going to trial rather than settling, because a higher judgment means a higher payout for them. This introduces a third, invisible and highly aggressive player into the marriage's end, one that cares nothing for the family's future and everything for the potential outcomes of the litigation. This brings us to the most unsettling statistic of all. In the Southwest, we are seeing a decline in the number of people who successfully complete a divorce within 2 years. The process has become so complex, so expensive, and so laden with technical requirements that many couples find themselves in a state of legal limbo. They are no longer living together. They are no longer emotionally connected, but they are trapped in a multi-year bureaucratic purgatory where their assets are frozen, their futures are on hold, and their lives are dictated by a rotating cast of experts and evaluators. As we reach the conclusion of this data analysis, we have to look at the broader implications for the American Southwest. Is the frontier dream dead? If the very laws of the region make the formation and dissolution of families so treacherous, what does that mean for the long-term stability of these booming states? We have seen how the geography isolates us, how the laws trap us, and how the costs ruin us. But as we move into the final part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the survivors. We are going to look at the data of what happens 10 years after a Southwestern divorce. We will examine the potential outcomes for those who manage to rebuild, the emerging trends in pre-divorce planning, and the one single factor that determines whether a person emerges from this system with their sanity and their wealth intact, or whether they become just another tragic data point in the Great Sunbelt Fracture. What is the one thing no one tells you about the day after the final decree is signed? The one thing no one tells you about the day after the final decree is signed in the American Southwest is that the legal conclusion of your marriage is merely the administrative commencement of a new, decade-long financial and psychological trajectory. In the year 2026, the data suggests that the true cost of a Sunbelt divorce is not measured in the thousands of dollars paid to attorneys during the litigation, but in the structural opportunity cost of the 10 years that follow. We are observing a phenomenon where the high-stakes environment of states like Arizona and Texas creates a permanent divergence in wealth accumulation between those who successfully navigate the post-decree landscape and those who fall into the secondary trap of the recovery phase. To understand the long-term potential outcomes, imagine it is now late 2026 and we are looking at Marcus, a high-earning individual who just finalized his dissolution in Houston. He has survived the 50-50 split of his community estate. He has accepted the 5-year cap on spousal maintenance. He walks out of the courtroom with half of his original net worth. In a traditional economic model, Marcus should be able to rebuild his wealth through his high salary. However, the Southwestern reality in 2026 introduces a friction point known as the lifestyle tax of the newly single. Because the regional infrastructure is built for the dual-income nuclear family, Marcus must now maintain a household that mirrors the standard of living required for his children during their periods of possession. He is paying for a 3-bedroom home, massive utility loads, and high property taxes on a single income, while simultaneously paying the maximum cap of spousal maintenance and child support. The historical trends for men in Marcus's position show a significant risk of what economists call the middle-class slide. While the initial asset split was 50-50, the ongoing cash flow drain prevents Marcus from investing in the very markets that built his initial wealth. He is no longer able to maximize his 401k contributions because his liquid income is diverted to maintenance payments. Over a 10-year period, the loss of compound interest on those missed contributions creates a $1 million gap in his retirement readiness compared to his married peers. This is the silent erosion of the Sunbelt dream. The divorce does not just take half of what you have today, it potentially takes 80% of what you would have had a decade from now. Conversely, consider the case of Sophia, who was the lower-earning spouse. She receives the $5,000 monthly maintenance check in Texas, but she faces the rehabilitative cliff we discussed. In 2026, the data shows that the most successful survivors are those who aggressively pivot their career within the first 24 months. Those who wait until the 60-month maintenance period is nearly exhausted to begin their vocational training almost universally face a standard of living collapse. The case studies of women in the Southwest who successfully rebuilt their lives often involve a move toward the high-demand sectors of the regional economy: healthcare, renewable energy, or specialized tech services. Those who attempt to return to the general administrative roles they held 15 years ago find that the 2026 labor market has entirely outpaced them, leaving them in a state of permanent underemployment. We must also look at the massive demographic shift in the housing market caused by these survivors. In major southwestern hubs, we are seeing the rise of the divorce colony. These are specific neighborhoods or apartment complexes that have become unintentional hubs for single parents and recent divorcees. Because the cost of living remains so high, we are seeing an unprecedented increase in co-living arrangements among divorced adults. Two single mothers in Scottsdale might rent a large home together to share the costs of the desert infrastructure and provide mutual childcare. This is a radical departure from the suburban isolation of the previous decade. The statistics show that these communal recovery models are actually producing better psychological outcomes for the children than the traditional, isolated single-parent household. However, the 2026 data also reveals a darker trend: the recurring litigation cycle. In the Southwest, a final decree is rarely truly final. Because the regional economy is so volatile, particularly in the energy and tech sectors, we see a massive volume of motions for modification. If Marcus loses his job in a 2026 market correction, he must return to court to ask for a reduction in support. This triggers a new round of legal fees and forensic auditing. The historical trends suggest that for a significant percentage of Southwestern families, the legal system remains an active participant in their lives until the youngest child turns 18. The emotional and financial exhaustion of this perpetual litigation creates a state of chronic stress that has long-term health implications, which researchers are now beginning to link to the higher rates of cardiovascular issues seen in high-conflict divorcees in the Sun Belt. But there is a new movement of proactive planning emerging in 2026. We are seeing a surge in the use of postnuptial agreements among couples who are staying together but want to de-risk their financial future. These couples have watched their neighbors lose everything to the community property trap and are choosing to contractually define their assets while the relationship is still healthy. This is the ultimate defensive maneuver in the modern Southwest. By moving from the default state laws to a private, contract-based arrangement, they are attempting to insulate their wealth from the potential outcomes of a future fracture. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we have to look at the ultimate question. Has the Southwest become too legally and financially hazardous for the American family? The statistics show that despite the risks, the migration continues. People are still chasing the sun, the space, and the lack of state income tax. But the savvy arrivals of 2026 are no longer moving blindly. They are arriving with a sophisticated understanding of the community property labyrinth. They are building premarital and postmarital safety nets. They are diversifying their support systems beyond the isolated suburban bunker. The Great Sunbelt Fracture is not an inevitability, but it is a highly probable statistical outcome for those who ignore the regional legal architecture. The survivors of this decade-long demographic earthquake are those who treat their marriage not just as a romantic bond, but as the most significant economic and legal contract of their lives. They are the ones who understand that in a land of boundless horizons, the most important boundaries are the ones written in the law. We have mapped the financial destruction, the geographic cages, the psychological warfare, and the grueling road to recovery. But the data shows that even in the face of these staggering odds, the human capacity for reinvention is the most powerful variable in the equation. The Southwestern divorce is a brutal transition, but for those who study the data and navigate the pitfalls with forensic precision, it can also be the catalyst for a more resilient, intentional, and stable future. The frontier is still there, but in 2026, the only way to conquer it is to understand the rules of the ground you are standing on. This concludes our deep dive into the statistics of divorce in the U.S. Southwest. We have covered the infrastructure of isolation, the traps of community property, and the high conflict cycles that define this region. But as the 2026 economy continues to shift, there is a new, even more complex variable emerging on the horizon. We are beginning to see the first legal cases involving the division of digital consciousness, virtual assets, and AI-generated intellectual property within the family court system. How do you divide a community estate when half of its value exists in a decentralized, digital world that the law hasn't even begun to define? That is a story for the next deep dive.